I'm Kim. I'm gonna take you upstairs to the History House and show you some of the really neat things that we have upstairs to share with you. Upstairs in the History House, we have this exhibit right at the top of the stairs here, and these are things that you would find in a house in the 1800s, because back in the old days you couldn't of course go to Walmart and buy clothes. You would have to make your own clothes. And the first thing you would do is you would shear your sheep. And as I tell school kids, sheep come in brown and black and white, and if you wanted a different color, you would have to dye your wool. So if you had your ball, if you made your yarn on a spinning wheel and then wound it up into a ball, you wouldn't be able to dye the yarn this way because the center of the ball wouldn't get a lot of color in it. You'd want to have a skein of yarn so the dye could evenly coat the yarn. So they had this contraption called a niddy noddy, and as far as I can tell, you turned it like a baton to kind of get the yarn on it. But the thing is, you would have to count, say 40 times, because you'd want all of your skeins to be the same size so everything would be dyed evenly. But say you're like doing this and you're counting to 40 and your sister is talking to you blah 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 and you lose track of time, it's not really very efficient, because you would have all different sizes. So what they did was they invented this contraption here, and this is called a weasel. And the way the weasel worked was you would set your gauge here to the whatever size you wanted your skein to be, and then you'd just sit and turn this wheel here, and if you can see the top of that, the box here, the arrow is turning, so that's doing the counting for you. So you could be talking to your sister, blah, 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 and you don't have to worry about losing your track of what number you were on. So by the time you got to 40, the center of that would pop up, and that's why it's called a weasel, or that's where the phrase "pop goes the weasel" allegedly comes from, because that's a weasel. And as I said, this is a spinning wheel, and we actually have a picture of a woman spinning on this very wheel. And you can see she doesn't look very happy, because while we might think it was, you know, idyllic romantic work in the country, it was pretty hard work. And since, again, you couldn't go to the store to buy clothes necessarily in the beginning, you know, it had to be done, so it took a lot of the fun out of it. This is a pretty neat machine. This is pre-Singer, which, as you know, is probably the most common sewing machine. This one was patented in 1850, and Singer didn't take over until the early 1900s. So this was what sewing machines look like for a long time. It has the treadle foot, so even if there was no power, you know, you could sew away. And a lot of the features that would be familiar today are still here. The foot and the bobbin would go under here, but everything is all different from how it is today. So they must have improved things, changed things to improve them, just like they did with the niddy noddy and the weasel. So yeah, that's this room. All right, this here would have been the parents' bedroom, we believe. It's the biggest room. There's also a heating duct here. The other room, which you'll see, doesn't have a heating duct, but this one does, so we think it was the parents' room. This would have been their bed, and it's one of those neat old beds that has a rope frame down here, and that's where the phrase "sleep tight" comes from, because you'd want your ropes to be nice and tight, otherwise you'd wake up in the morning, you know, kind of halfway to the floor. There's a really neat feather mattress here, so it was nice and soft. And as you can see, there's a gorgeous quilt on top. We have a lot of quilts and old braided rugs here. And it's interesting because sometimes when we do tours with school kids, the girls, you know, they'll look at all these clothes in the closet, a lot of formal clothes in here. And the kids will ask, you know, where are all the street clothes, all the things that they wore every day? We see there are all these fancy clothes here. And I always tell them, you know, the street clothes, after they got so beat up and you couldn't wear them anymore, they turned them into quilts, and they turned them into rugs. They didn't throw anything away. They used stuff until it evaporated out the window. This here is a beautiful wedding dress that was made by hand in 1900 by a woman named Mabel Harris. She made it for her daughter's wedding. And I find it absolutely incredible for a number of reasons. This work up here must have taken forever. And also, she's so petite. But it's a beautiful dress, and hopefully the daughter had many happy years of wedded bliss. But the rest of the room you can see is furnished with things that probably would have been in, you know, a bedroom of the late 1850s. The family that lived here had 10 kids, so there were probably at any given time maybe 1 or 2 babies in a crib in this room. And over here, we have some Margaret Chase Smith items. This is a dress that she wore and her shoes. But then her high school picture back when students actually went to Washington, D.C. to see the Capitol. Also on this little table here are a lot of drugstore bottles. They all have names of Skowhegan drugstores. This one is Samson and Avor. They're right on the corner of Water Street and Madison Avenue. And Bixby and Buck. And this one I really like. This is Fogg's Drugstore, and it says Essence of Anise. I would love to have been able to go through the store and see all the old tinctures and things that they had then. But we're very lucky to have a bunch of those. And then the most wonderful thing perhaps in this room is this cabinet here. And this is an anadrosas cabinet. This is something that you will never see anywhere else. A Skowhegan man named Dr. Samuel Conant, he wasn't really a doctor, but he was a pretty great guy. He was a local photographer, and we have a lot of his photographs as well, but he came up with this idea, and it was so successful. He had this building down the street that was packed constantly. People came from across the country to have this treatment done. What would happen is they would walk in the door, an attendant would help them disrobe, and they would step inside this cabinet, sit down, and the attendant would take these crystals, sprinkle them on this contraption here. They would light it and then put that inside with the person, close them back up so the head would just pop out. And we think the person would maybe sit in there for half an hour or so, after which they would come out and the attendant would sprinkle this liniment on them, and like magic, any aches or pains they had would just disappear. And it was so successful they had them for horses. It supposedly made lame horses run, and all the hotels in Skowhegan would fill up, so they actually had to build a hotel in Norwalk. There was a ferry that came to bring people to Skowhegan just to have this treatment done. And eventually it was so successful that they couldn't even treat everybody here, so they franchised it. And they sent these cabinets like overseas. The Sultan of Brunei apparently bought one. They would send them all over the place, and people would have to still just keep buying the crystals and the liniment. But it was really successful, and they made a lot of people happy until opium was outlawed, because that's all it was opium. This room we think probably was one of the 2 kids' rooms. There's this room and then the room next door, which is a mirror image of this room. And if they had 10 kids, we're assuming that they probably had 5 in one and 5 in the other, maybe 5 girls here and 5 boys there. And as you can see, it's a pretty small room, but back then they didn't have toys and a lot of toys or computer games, and probably not a lot of clothes. But anyway, we've decided to put children's things in this room because this was probably the kids' room. This here is really special. This belonged to Louise Coburn, the woman who founded the History House. This was hers when she was a little girl, and she was born in 1856, so this is probably from the 1860s or so. Her dad made it for her, which is in itself pretty special. You can see it's made out of an old cabinet. There's there are hinges here and would have shut there, but everything in it is at least from 1919 when it was refurbished. She gave it to her niece, then. But I'm assuming it was she who made a lot of these rugs. It's very, very cute. So she was a very lucky little girl. And I enjoy dusting this when the History House opens in the spring. The other things in here are all really sweet because you know they didn't come from China. They didn't come wrapped up in plastic. They were all handmade. Even down to, you know, the boots on the dolls. These dolls are all China dolls. Some of them are kind of creepy looking. It's not their fault though. You can see this one here is missing an eye. She's always a favorite with the school kids. Her eye is rattling inside her body though, because the way that they held the glass eyes in place was with wax. So the wax on that eye melted at some point and the eyeball dropped inside. But they're still very sweet. This sofa is pretty special because it's covered in horsehair upholstery, and it's still made nowadays, but it's really, really expensive, and so it's not every day that you see it. You can tell old horsehair upholstery because it'll be really narrow, because you figure a horse's tail is only so long. But it was really, really time consuming to make, but it was very coveted because it lasts forever. And since it was so expensive, you'll usually see it only on really fine furniture like this. So we're very lucky to have this too. The other neat thing in this room is this rocking horse. And this was another thing that was made for Louise, the History House founder. Her grandfather made that for her. He carved it out of a tree that fell on his property. So I don't know how many lucky kids could say their grandparents carved them rocking horses nowadays, but it's pretty neat. The mane is amazing, the bridle, it's all really detailed. He did a really good job on that. But all the other toys in here would have belonged to very lucky little children. And again, note there aren't any vents in the floor here, so those 5 kids that slept in here in the wintertime when it's minus 20, they really probably had to just huddle together to keep warm. That's the upstairs. If you have any questions, please be sure to ask either me or any of the guides, and we'll be able to answer those questions for you. Thanks again.